So here's a question that I want you to think about. Why were there so many caveman games in the early 90s? Because there were a ton of them. Bonk, Joe and Mac, Chuck Rock, Congo's Caper. It just went on and on. The market was absolutely flooded with guys in loincloths hitting things with clubs. And it wasn't just the games either. Television and movie theaters got them too. Suddenly, cavemen were just everywhere, and nobody really questioned why. Hey guys, welcome back. Today, we're looking at 3 of these caveman games that I'm sure at least most of you saw in your video store at one point. We've got a mascot trying to survive a console that he wasn't even born on, a British cult classic that basically started this whole trend, and one that almost nobody remembers and really shouldn't be anywhere near as good as it is. So let's just get into it with one that I'm pretty sure most of the folks across the pond are very familiar with. First up is one that I'm pretty sure at least most of you have heard of, and that's Chuck Rock. And besides Bonk and Joe and Mac, Chuck Rock's probably the most familiar caveman game from around that time. Chuck Rock originally came out back in 1991 and was developed and published by Core Design for both the Amiga and the Atari ST, and then pretty much just ported to every platform in existence over the next few years. The Genesis version that we're looking at today was published by Virgin Interactive in 1992, and Core Design by this point was basically just a relatively small British studio that you'd probably know a little bit better for a little game they made a few years later, something called Tomb Raider. So before Lara Croft came around, Core was known for a game about a fat caveman who yells "Oonga Boonga." But the thing about Chuck Rock, and really all of these caveman games, is that it's worth understanding when they actually came out. In the early 90s, there was kind of this weird wave of prehistoric nostalgia hitting everything simultaneously. Stuff like Encino Man bringing cavemen to the present day, dinosaurs getting their own damn sitcom, and even the Flintstones was getting a movie, which we covered last year. So for whatever reason, there was just this appetite for caveman stuff, and Chuck Rock hit right at the start of that wave on home computers, where it became a massive success. It got ported to so many platforms over the following years that by 1994 it was still showing up on new systems. That's how popular this thing was, especially in Europe. Chuck Rock here is, of course, a side-scrolling platformer, and he can do pretty much everything you'd expect a fat caveman to do. His primary attack is his belly. He just kind of walks into enemies and bumps them with his stomach. He can also pick up rocks and chuck them, which is where the name comes from. But that's pretty much everything you need to get through this entire game. And really you don't need too much else because everything you can do here works pretty well. The belly bump does have a short range that can take some getting used to, and figuring out the right distance to stand to actually connect does take a bit of practice, but once everything clicks, the whole thing kind of has this slapstick quality to it that fits the game perfectly. Chucking rocks, though, is a little bit more interesting than what it first appears. You can chuck them at enemies, but you can also chuck rocks to reach higher places, and even carry them above your head to protect you from stuff falling on top of you. There's also some nice little touches here and there, like how carrying a heavy rock on an ice level will prevent you from sliding around on the ice, and carrying a rock into water will keep you from floating. It's not like deep puzzle design or anything like that, but it does add some exploration to the game since a lot of the levels have multiple ways around them. And really, there's not too many bad things I can say about this one. The worst being that the belly bump just never really feels that great, but the game never really needs you to be that accurate with it besides some boss fights. And even then, you can kinda just spam it. Enemies also have a bad habit of hiding just behind the foreground scenery and then hitting you before you can even see them. And they also like throwing things at you from off screen. And none of these are game breaking or anything like that, but they are annoying when it happens. And if you're wondering if the Genesis and Super Nintendo versions are actually different from each other, well, a little. The Genesis version has a completely new soundtrack for each of the 5 worlds, which is a significant upgrade over the Amiga original that mostly just had one song. And the Super Nintendo version has animated backgrounds with some nice parallax scrolling that the Genesis version doesn't really have. But they're both good versions of the same game. Though I'm sure someone in the comments are going to inevitably tell you why the Genesis version is far superior. And one last thing, we can't forget about the villain of the game, Gary Gritter, a T-Rex bully who kidnaps Chuck's wife Ophelia, but that's not really the problem. The game very clearly named this character after a real British glam rock musician who was extremely famous in the UK at the time. But these days, that name has a very different connotation than it did in 1991. The folks in the UK watching this definitely know what I'm talking about. And for everyone else, just go look it up to see why I'm not going to go into further detail on it in this video. Chuck Rock, though, is a genuinely charming game that's held up better than a lot of what it was competing with in 1992. The belly bump combat is funny, and the rock mechanic gives it a little bit more depth than you'd probably think it has at first glance. It's not a long game, and it's not a hard game, but it is a consistently entertaining game. And also, it just kind of helps set the scene for this whole subgenre of caveman games. Without Chuck Rock doing as well as it did on home computers, you probably wouldn't get the same kind of flood of prehistoric platformers that followed. And while games like Bonk and Joe and Mac existed before Chuck Rock cracked the European market wide open for caveman games, that still doesn't take away from just how influential Chuck Rock was. And pretty much everything else that we're covering today owes this belly-maxing caveman a debt of gratitude. Next up is Super Bonk, and I need to give you a little bit of context before we get into this one, because Super Bonk is super weird. Bonk is, of course, Hudson Soft's mascot, a prehistoric kid with an enormous head who attacks by headbutting things. And he had 3 games on the TurboGrafx-16, Hudson's own console, where he was basically just the system's answer to Mario and Sonic. And all 3 of those games are pretty dang good, and probably one of the games that made you jealous of the 1 or 2 kids that actually owned a TurboGrafx. Super Bonk, though, came out in 1994, and it was Bonk's first and only appearance on the Super Nintendo. And that whole situation is kind of interesting, because by then, TurboGrafx was basically dead in the water. And with the successor to the TurboGrafx still in the works, Hudson needed Bonk to show up on someone else's hardware. So they handed the Super Nintendo version over to developer AI Co., and the result is a game that's competent, but also super weird in ways that go beyond the typical caveman platformer. The first 2 TurboGrafx Bonk games were made by a developer called Red Company and had a consistent feel across both games. But the third Bonk game, Bonk's Big Adventure, was developed by AI Co., and they started introducing some of the stranger stuff into the series, like size-changing candies that made Bonk super small or super big. But when Hudson handed them the reins to do Super Bonk, they just went wild. The Super Nintendo version just adds a ton of extra stuff, like time travel, even more transformation power-ups, and a bigger world with multiple paths through each stage. None of which had really been attempted in a Bonk game before, and the results are a little bit mixed. If you've played a Bonk game on the TurboGrafx, then you'll notice that the core Bonk stuff is all here on the Super Nintendo. You're a big-headed caveman kid. You headbutt things. You bite onto ledges to climb around levels. All of this is the basics of the series, and they're all intact here on the Super Nintendo. But what Super Bonk adds on top of that is a transformation system that's probably one of the more creative things in any of these caveman games. Find a chunk of meat and Bonk transforms. He can become Fester Bonk with these giant bushy eyebrows and can shoot paralyzing projectiles. He can also become Kronk Bonk, which is kind of like a lizard version of Bonk, and finally a crab that can shoot stuff for whatever reason. But even crazier is that there's this whole candy system that changes his size and how each of those forms play. Like normal size Kronk Bonk kinda just has this tongue that he can shoot out and attack with. But find the right kind of candy and you can become Big Kronk, letting you go full Godzilla mode on the stage. And all 3 of these forms can even be shrunken down, letting you scream that you can then use as platforms. It's weird, I know. Like I said, there's a lot going on in this game. And that doesn't even stop with the levels either. This is one of those games that just has a ton of sections for each level. And Super Bonk takes that and runs with it because of just how many different ways you can make it through each level. There are branching paths hidden all over the place, secret exits that drop you into completely different levels. Plus, the transformation system means that certain areas are only accessible depending on which form you're currently in. So 2 runs through the same level can feel completely different depending on what power-ups you found around and what size you happen to be at any given moment. It gives the game a lot more replay value than you'd probably think it has, and it rewards players who want to poke around at every corner of the stage rather than just running to the exit because you genuinely never know what you'll end up finding. It also doesn't hurt that the game looks just as good or better than the TurboGrafx Bonk games. And if all this sounds so great, why do people never talk about this game? Well, it's kinda got a couple of problems, but the biggest are the controls. If you've ever played a Bonk game before, you're gonna immediately notice it. Bonk kinda has this floatiness to him that's way more pronounced than it is in the TurboGrafx games. And whether that's intentional or the result of the Super Nintendo port is kinda hard to say, but it does cause some really annoying deaths more often than it should. The result is that it just never really feels like a Bonk game, even though you're doing all the Bonk stuff. Also, the game is kinda short and not very challenging, but I do think this is one of those games that needs repeat playthroughs to find everything that it has to offer. But whether you want to play it multiple times is another thing entirely. Super Bonk is the Bonk game that most Bonk fans consider as the odd one out. When it's doing its weird transformation stuff and sending you inside a dinosaur or to the moon, it's a pretty neat little game that has a lot of charm to it. There's just so much variety here, and the power-up system is more creative than most platformers on the Super Nintendo. But it just never really fully escapes the feeling that it doesn't play as well as those TurboGrafx 16 games. Unfortunately, the game went largely unnoticed on release, and only really got rediscovered later by people digging through the Super Nintendo library. I personally, though, really like Super Bonk, but I like weird games in general. It's just one of those games that you never know what you're gonna get most of the time. But if you've never played a Bonk game and want to start somewhere, the original TurboGrafx Bonk's Adventure is a better introduction to the series. But if you've already done that and want more Bonk, then Super Bonk does give you more, it's just not necessarily better. And I think we saved the best for last, because we got one here that almost no one has heard of and really has no business being as good as it is. Prehistorik Man on the Super Nintendo was developed and published by Titus back in 1996. And if you're wondering how you missed out on one of the best Super Nintendo platformers ever made, well, join the crowd. And maybe that has a little bit to do with the developer, Titus. If you know the name from the Super Nintendo library, it's probably not for good reasons. Titus is probably most famously or infamously known for publishing Superman 64 on the Nintendo 64. But before that, they published a bunch of forgettable licensed games throughout the 90s, and generally wasn't a studio that you associated with quality. Prehistorik Man, though, just came out of nowhere, and it's legit the best Super Nintendo game that they ever put out, and it's not even particularly close. Believe it or not, Prehistorik Man is actually a sequel to a DOS game called Prehistoric 2 from 1993. But this game didn't arrive in North America until '96, and that's pretty late for a Super Nintendo platformer. Donkey Kong Country had already been out for 2 years. The Nintendo 64 was right around the corner too. Nobody was really looking for a new Super Nintendo caveman game. And so when Prehistorik Man did arrive, it arrived like a fart in the wind. It actually did get decent reviews at the time, but that didn't really generate much attention. Which is a real shame because, like I said, this is one of the more solid hidden gems on the console. You play as a caveman named Sam, and the whole premise of the game is that greedy dinosaurs stole all the food from his village in the middle of the night, and Sam has to now travel to a valley full of dinosaur bones so that his village can use those bones as currency to buy more food. It's strangely convoluted for a caveman game. To do this, Sam runs around collecting food and bones across a jungle that just happens to be perfect for a side-scrolling platform game. You've got your standard caveman club for attacking enemies, and it does its job with a satisfying crunch to it whenever you bash it upside the enemy's skull. You could also run around like a dog, giving you more range for your jump, and you've also got a roar attack that you can power up, which actually kinda acts almost exactly like the roar in Radical Rex, and I promise that's the only Radical Rex comparison I'm gonna make in this video. Each stage has a ton of food to collect, which is tallied up at the end of the stage, and in true Donkey Kong Country style, there's bonus letters scattered around that you can collect to open up a bonus stage. There's also stuff like a shop that you can find hidden in stages where you can buy stage hints and power-ups, and you're probably listening to all this and being like, man, this just kind of sounds like your typical platformer on the Super Nintendo, so what makes this thing actually special? Well, just about every stage in this game has some sort of objective to it, sometimes even multiple objectives on top of whatever new gimmick that each stage introduces. Like early on, there's a stage where you need to find 3 stones to open an entrance, and the village chief gives you hints to make your way through the stage to find them. Later on, you're in an ape-man village where you need to beat ape men to death with your club to find the keys to open the lock on the trapped hunter. And even when there isn't really an objective, the stage usually has something unique that you need to overcome, like jumping across a burning jungle or using wind gusts to make your way up a tree trunk. And the crazy thing is that this isn't even full sections of the game. This is every single stage usually coming up with some new way to get through it. There's even vehicle stages mixed in, like a hang glider that you made from a dinosaur skin that, yes, you had to find from a previous stage. There's just so many stages in this game that feel genuinely inventive in ways that you wouldn't expect from a caveman platformer in 1996. It's also one of the better looking Super Nintendo games too. The visuals have this Saturday morning cartoon quality to them with bright colors and super expressive animations. It doesn't really immediately blow you away like something like Donkey Kong Country, but the more you play it, the more little things you see that impresses you. I guess if you want to complain about something, once you get past the solid gameplay, Prehistorik Man doesn't really do anything especially new. It's essentially just a well-made version of things you've probably already played on the Super Nintendo. But it does everything so well and so consistently that it's hard not to play several stages in a row just because you want to see what's next. Prehistorik Man is just the best game in this whole damn video, and sadly, also the one that got the least attention then and continues to get the least attention now. For a Titus game in 1996, it's just crazy how good this is. It also just never got the cult following that it deserved, probably because it arrived so late with almost no marketing behind it. If this had come out in like 1993, I think it would be remembered a lot more fondly. Instead, it's a hidden gem that most Super Nintendo fans have never even touched. But in a weird twist of fate, this is probably the easiest game out of all the other caveman games to play these days because it didn't just stay on the Super Nintendo. Prehistorik Man also got a port to the Game Boy Advance in 2001. It even came out on the Nintendo DS in 2010 with stylus support, though I think that was for DSiWare and I don't think that's available anymore. But hold on, we're not done yet, because if you own a Switch and a Nintendo Online membership, you can play it right now, since it's also included in the Super Nintendo Virtual Library on there. So you've just got no excuse not to play this game these days. And I really think you should, especially if you want to try out something that just really flew under the radar back then. This isn't just the best caveman game on the Super Nintendo, it may be the best caveman game ever. Yeah, I said it, ever. And coming from a real-life caveman, I think that's pretty high praise. And there you go. There's 3 caveman games that all have 3 pretty different stories. And the question that I started the video with, why were there so many caveman games in the early 90s? Well, I think the honest answer is that the prehistoric setting was just a really easy creative shortcut. Simple jungle settings, built-in humor, and no need for a complicated story. A caveman hits something with a club. That's pretty much all you need. It's not profound, but it turns out that it's enough to make some genuinely enjoyable games when the people making them actually care. But I think that's gonna do it for me this week. If you grew up with any of these or have a favorite caveman game that I didn't cover today, then let me know down in the comments. I'm genuinely curious which ones people remember, because we all remember at least one of these. Also, give this one a thumbs up if you had some fun watching this prehistoric trip down memory lane. And also, maybe a sub to the channel if you want to stick around for some more caveman games in the future. But as always, thanks for watching this one, and have a great week.